Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Tracy Steffes. I'm chair of the education department. And I'm really excited to introduce Professor Hilary Levey Friedman, talking about her new book. Here she is, The Complicated Reign of the Beauty Pageant in America. Professor Friedman was trained as a sociologist at Harvard and Princeton and is now a visiting assistant professor in the education department and a fellow at the Taubman Center. Her first book, Playing to Win, Raising Children in a Competitive Culture, focused on competitive after-school activities. Professor Friedman has written widely for a public audience about her work, including in Time, the New York Times, USA Today, the Providence Journal, the Jewish Voice, Psychology Today, among many other venues. And Professor Friedman is also very active in political and civic life. She's currently the president of the Rhode Island chapter of the National Organization for Women. She's also a member of the Public Policy Committee of the United Way of Rhode Island, a member of the Platform and Issues Committee of the Rhode Island Democratic Party, and a volunteer court-appointed special advocate. And that's just what she's doing right now. In the past, she's been involved in a number of other civic and political activities, including serving on the East Greenwich Democratic Town Committee and as an affordable housing commissioner in East Greenwich. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Professor Friedman, for being here. And please join me in welcoming Professor Friedman. If you have questions during the talk, feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll also take raised hands at the end. Professor Friedman is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So thank you and welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna start my slides here. I try to do picture heavy slides these days because we're spending so much time looking at screens and text. So I try to just do the pictures, and I'm would love to hear some of your questions. I see some of you I know on the call, some names I know. So I know there's lots of students. And so I wanted to start by telling you about how this book was born. And then I'm gonna give you an overview of the book, and then I'll talk about the three things that we're highlighting tonight, which are tuition, talent, and Trump, with an emphasis on the tuition, given the education department. So a lot of people wonder, why did you do this book? And did you do a beauty pageant yourself? So the answer is, I have never competed in a beauty pageant, but my mother, sorry, my slides are not advancing at the moment because I'm on Zoom still. My mother was Miss America in 1970. So I have a personal connection here. As I write in the book, I grew up, I never not knew what a beauty pageant was, which I came to understand later was not true for everybody. So I'm not just being self-deprecating when I say that my mom and I really look nothing alike, because we really look nothing alike. So this is a picture. The book starts, I talk about a bunch of experiences I've had when I was around 9 years old. So that's about how old I was here. And growing up, I thought that beauty and brains were mutually exclusive because my mom was the beauty and I was the brains. And that's how I made sense of our relationship. And my primary interest was in school and being a bookworm. And so it just seemed like those things didn't go together. But I went off to college. I grew up in Michigan. My mom had been Miss Michigan. And I went to Harvard for college, where I discovered sociology. Sociology was something I'd actually never even heard of before. But the first semester, my freshman year, we had a shopping period as well, and one of my roommates was going to check out this class called social stratification, and I was like, that sounds interesting. And that basically changed the course of my life in many ways. I said, sociology is this discipline that covers all the things that I'm interested in. I can do history and literature, and politics and people, and that just really pulled it all together for me. And at the end of that class, the social stratification class, my teaching fellow wrote at the end of my final paper, "You're really good at this. You should consider sociology." And, some of you might remember what it was like to be a first year and you're like, what am I doing? Where do I belong? And so for someone to go out of their way to say that really meant a lot to me. So I took intro to sociology the next semester, and then at the end of that year declared that I was a sociology concentrator. So my sophomore year, we had to do an intro to methods course that lasted, with a project that lasted the entire semester. So a lot of my classmates were picking topics like, why do Black students sit together in the cafeteria? Just things that were around us on campus. But I, as you can see, this was a picture from when I was about 4 or 5. I've always sort of wondered about all this stuff, and it was shortly after the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. So I started thinking, maybe I could do a project on this and why mothers put their young daughters in child beauty pageants, and I could go to some, and I could interview people, and I could do a content analysis of these magazines they put out. And so I got really excited about that. Now, at the time, I didn't think about this, but now I figured out I was subconsciously trying to stay connected to my mom in some way, because I had gone off and our lives were very different. And so even though I had resisted this beauty pageant thing, and by the time I was in high school, I didn't want anybody to know, here I am looking at beauty pageants. So this paper became my senior thesis, and I discovered I really liked doing research. I was able to apply for some research grants that covered my work-study job. And so when I say that class my first year of college changed my life, I really mean it, because I never thought I would do a PhD in sociology. So JonBenet Ramsey, strangely, I'm connected to, and all of these things come together. And I found out some really interesting things in my thesis, which looked at moms who had daughters 6 and under who were competing in child beauty pageants. One of which was that they felt like they had to be preparing their kids for this very competitive world. So I thought I was finding something different about American childhood and how competition was occurring in American childhood. But no one was so interested in the particulars of that, because they could not get past the quote unquote crazy pageant moms and couldn't really take the rest of it seriously. So when I went off to graduate school, and the product of that is my first book, Playing to Win, Raising Children in a Competitive Culture, I very deliberately picked these more modal activities of chess and dance and soccer that many elementary school age kids participate in. So I did that. There was still a little bit of the pageant element, because I did this competitive dance stuff. So I joke I was studying Dance Moms before Dance Moms was a thing. But I just couldn't get away from this beauty pageant stuff. I mean, I became a mom, moved on to other things in my life. And this really was driven home to me when I came to Brown in the first semester I was here. It was fall 2015. And I taught a seminar called Beauty Pageants in American Society. And one of the students in that class came in, and she had been Miss North Dakota's outstanding teen. I had another person in the class who had done this outstanding teen program, which is part of the Miss America program, just for teenagers. And we became close. She came to my office hours. We talked a lot. I ended up advising her senior thesis, which was about the Miss America pageant. She was a BEO concentrator about the nonprofit status and how Miss America was run. And at the end of that, toward the end of her senior year, she said, I've decided I'm going to compete for Miss North Dakota again. And I said, I'm going to come watch you compete, because 1, when am I ever going to go to North Dakota again, potentially? And 2, this is so amazing. My student who I've gotten close to, is going to compete, and I want to be there to support her. So I went to Williston, North Dakota, and Cara Munns, who's class of 2016, was first runner-up that year. And she basically won everything except the swimsuit portion, and she was first runner-up. So the next year was her last year to compete in terms of age eligibility, and she decided to do that. Went back to North Dakota, won everything, won the title of Miss North Dakota. The next day I was like, all right, I'm going to Atlantic City. And long story short, she became Miss America 2018. I was there. I say it was one of the top 5 coolest things I've ever experienced, to see someone's sort of lifelong dream fulfilled in front of your eyes. And I said, okay, the universe is telling me I have to do this book. And the other reason that this was meaningful to me is that because I am very involved in the organized feminist movement. And so I felt like, okay, my mom was Miss America, my student became Miss America, I'm a sociologist, I have this insider outsider perspective because I've never done pageants, but I've been close to them, and I'm a feminist. And so what is this different perspective that I can offer that's not out there about beauty pageants? So the results of that is this book. Here she is, The Complicated Reign of the Beauty Pageant in America. This is the table of contents from the book, just to give you a sense. And so I want to give you a quick overview of how the book is organized and how I use beauty pageants to trace the arc of American feminism. So in general, especially with part one, but overall, this book basically looks at how we move from the suffragists who, this is their march in 1913 for women's suffrage, become this in 1921, less than a year after the 19th Amendment was ratified. So these are the contestants in the very first Miss America pageant. This was the swimsuit portion, a little bit different than how we look today. We definitely don't wear tights, but this is what the contestants recently look like. So this was actually the last year at Miss America that people competed in a bathing suit, and you can see Cara over there on the right-hand side of the picture. So definitely less covered up, wearing 6-inch heels, but still wearing those sashes. And, you know, today we have the sashes still come out in support of particularly things like the ERA. This was actually earlier this year in 2020. I know it's hard to believe that we ever gathered and didn't wear masks in the year 2020, but this was when Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the ERA. I picked this picture on purpose too, because you can see this transformation from the sash, which has become a bit of an anachronism. You can see one woman there on the side wearing the pink pussy hat, which has also already changed very quickly since 2016 and 2017, its meaning. But you still see women out there, but they're much more covered up in ways, but they're wearing pants, unlike the women in 1913. So this is the evolution that I'm most interested in the book. You know, there's some detours along the way. So part two begins with the 1968 protest outside of the Miss America pageant, which gave birth to the erroneous and pejorative term bra burners. So you can see that they had these freedom trash cans. The organizers, a group of women called the New York Radical Women, which was led by Robin Morgan. I've gone into her papers, and they did not get the permits. The mayor did not give them permission to burn anything on the boardwalk, which makes sense because it's a wooden boardwalk. And they were good girls and followed the rules, but they still had these trash cans. But a lot of the press releases had gone out already, saying that there would be trash cans and bras and other symbols of feminine oppression would be thrown in. And so the press reported that they burned bras, and for a variety of reasons, I think that term really took off. But that occurred outside of the Miss America pageant, and it was chosen because of the popularity of the pageant and how much cultural power it had. And it became a way to declare the second wave of feminism, which was about getting women more rights, both in terms of education and the workplace. So that's sort of the first part of the book, the second, chapters 1 through 3. The second part of the book really starts with what I consider to be part of the second wave of feminism, which is identity politics. And we get Vanessa Williams as Miss America 1984. It takes until 1984 to have the first woman of color, the first Black Miss America, and she has the dubious distinction of being the only Miss America to lose her title. So she was stripped of her title 6 weeks before she was supposed to give it up. She had taken, before she was Miss America, nude photos with another woman that were then printed in Penthouse magazine. So it wasn't just that she was nude, it was that she was nude with another woman. So there were issues around sexuality that came up as well. But many people thought that she was targeted, and people were really digging for things because of her race and that she was being singled out. So she's very interesting because she's probably the most successful Miss America of all time, which I think it's very possible she would have been even without the scandal. I think many people of the students' generation probably know her from Ugly Betty, but other people know her from lots of other shows and music and Broadway. But she really captured this time, the early 1980s, when identity politics were coming up, when the United States was trying to work toward more diversity, and we see that reflected in the Miss America pageant as well. As we move toward the third wave of feminism, we get this rise in infotainment and tabloid culture. So JonBenet Ramsey, who I already mentioned, was part of that. her murder was shortly after the O.J. Simpson murder trial. And so the press had already changed in that way. Without JonBenet, we don't get shows like Toddlers and Tiaras on TLC, which some of you probably have seen, and lots of other reality TV shows. So I think this is really important that in the early part of this century, we get a rise of a variety of reality TV shows, which really changes things in all kinds of ways. So RuPaul's Drag Race, I often say child beauty pageants are really truly drag because we're all born naked and the rest is drag. So there's lots of similarities in RuPaul's Drag Race. Also The Bachelor. I like to say The Bachelor is the new form of Miss America for many reasons, which I'm happy to talk more about. And then, of course, we also get shows like The Apprentice, which was part of the way that Donald Trump, who already had a large public persona, became much more known to a wider audience across the United States. So there is more Trump in the rest of the book, so particularly in this chapter 6, The Pageantry of Politics, because of course, as we all know, Donald Trump became president in 2016. But right before that, for about 20 years before that, he owned the Miss Universe pageant. So Miss Universe runs Miss Universe. It also owns Miss USA and Miss Teen USA. So that's an umbrella organization. In other parts of the world, all of those other ones are franchises of the Miss Universe pageant. So I picked this picture for two reasons. One is this is Olivia Culpo, who was Miss Rhode Island USA, probably. But we actually have several famous Rhode Island beauty queens, but she's probably the most successful, went on to become Miss USA and then became Miss Universe. So the year that Olivia Culpo gave up her crown was the year that the Miss Universe pageant was in Moscow, and when a lot of discussions had between Donald Trump Jr. and people in Russia, and perhaps the site of some other untoward things part of the Trump lore. So it's very important that he used to own Miss USA, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. We also have in this time Gretchen Carlson, who was Miss America 1989, went on to a career in the media. Many people knew her as being one of the hosts of Fox and Friends, and she rose to a different kind of prominence in 2016 when she sued Roger Ailes in the summer of 2016 for sexual harassment at Fox News. And so this is a very interesting way that Miss America is tied to the sexual harassment story. And Gretchen Carlson comes in, she takes over at the very, very beginning of 2018, actually, at Miss America, because the male chairman emails were leaked where he fat shamed and slut shamed particularly former Miss Americas. And in the era of Me Too, this was it should have been unacceptable anytime, but it was particularly unacceptable. So they bring Gretchen Carlson in to right the ship, and one of the first things she does is get rid of that swimsuit competition. So it's not a straight line, but you definitely can make the argument that because of Me Too, there is no longer a swimsuit competition at Miss America. So Gretchen Carlson had been involved in politics, not as a politician herself, but in terms of political media, and then goes on to be part of this major political movement that's tied to third wave feminism. We also get, and I will come back to this again, so I'll just mention it briefly, but in this time, we're seeing more pageant people move into politics. So Sarah Palin is one of the best examples of that. She never won the title of Miss Alaska. She was second runner-up. But, of course, she went on to become the 2008 vice presidential candidate for the Republicans, and sort of ushered in a new wave of how political candidates are covered and sort of what they do after. So there is more Trump in the book, but I want to start with the tuition part in our last sort of 10 minutes here. And, I used to say that the difference between Miss America and Miss USA was tuition, talent, and Trump. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Today, because Trump is gone, I'll tell you in a few minutes what I've changed that to. But people often confuse Miss USA and Miss America, and I'm like, well, of course, why should you? There's no reason you should necessarily know the difference, but there are key differences between these two pageants. But I want to talk about the tuition part first, because this is one of the biggest things that distinguishes Miss America, not just from Miss USA, but from other pageants as well. So Miss America started in 1921, as I said, started as a bathing beauty contest. When it began, again, less than a year after the 19th Amendment was ratified, it was entirely for the purpose of using women's bodies for men to make money. So a group of male businessmen come up with this idea to have this contest to extend the tourist season in Atlantic City so that their hotels and businesses would make more money. So there's really no confusion about that at all. By the end of the 1920s, there were many, many more contestants. There were lots of scandals and controversies over the women and were they the right kind of women. So they kind of shut down in the early 1930s before the Depression really hits, and decide to bring it back in 1937. And when they do, they bring this woman who's almost improbably named Lenora Slaughter. So she comes up to Atlantic City from Florida in 1937. She very quickly adds a talent component to the pageant and lots of other things. But probably the biggest thing that she did was in 1943, she got this idea, partly based on her own experiences early in her life, but that the way to distinguish Miss America, make her more quote unquote respectable, was to offer a scholarship, and that this would help attract the quote unquote right sort of woman. So in 1943, Miss America was still happening during World War II. Lenora Slaughter made the argument literally to the federal government that Miss America was about civic pride and it was part of the nation's identity and it needed to go on to boost civilian morale. And one of the conditions of that was that Miss America would sell war bonds. So the Miss America 1943 was a woman named Jean Bartel. She was the first woman who was attending college. She never actually finished college, but she was a college student when she won. And she sold the most war bonds of anybody in the country that year. And while she was doing that, she went to Minnesota, University of Minnesota. She was at a department store. Lenora Slaughter was there as her chaperone and traveling companion. And when they were at this department store, some members of Jean Bartel's sorority, she'd been a student in California, were there, and they invited them to the sorority house for tea after. And I call this the transformative tea. There's some disagreement among the parties about whose idea it was, but everyone agrees that at this tea it came up that Miss America should be offered a college scholarship, and that would be a way to support women's education in a completely new and different way. So it's very interesting to me that this happened with a sorority, because sororities obviously have lots of different connotations and have changed themselves over the years, but I do think that's an important component. It was a sorority house on a college campus where this conversation happened. So she gets this idea late 1943. The 1944 Miss America pageant happens, and after that goes well, she sits down and she writes a 6-page single-space type letter to the all-male board. And these are 2 of the pages. These are taken from her personal papers, which are housed at the Smithsonian in DC, the American History Museum. And I was very excited when I found this because this is a copy of the original letter that she sent, which she shared upon her retirement in 1967. So that's why it says 1967 at the top. So in the letter to the board, she wrote, quote, "Higher education has not yet been made available to the average American girl, and yet it can certainly play an influential part in her life. If the Miss America pageant lent its good influence to equipping one girl each year to achieving her goal, the nation would soon learn to respect us and be more willing to support us." So her proposal to do this was that in order to attract the quote-unquote finest type of American girls, that Miss America should be awarded a $5,000 college scholarship. And that could be to a college or university, a conservatory, music, dancing, or dramatic school. So she was broad, but it had to be about education. So in the letter, it's very interesting to me because obviously she's promoting education. She's very concerned that there's the right sort of woman who comes. But she wrote in a letter, quote, "I sincerely believe the average young American girl has 2 primary ambitions by the time she is 18. The first is a happy and successful marriage. The second is proper education to develop whatever talent she might possess. The second ambition will certainly better equip her to attain the first ambition. So to me, it's very interesting. Lenora Slaughter writes this as a 38-year-old single woman. And in order to convince these men that women should be educated, it still has to be couched in terms of marriage to make it palatable to the men, especially if that message was coming from a single accomplished woman herself. So in her final pitch in the letter, Slaughter articulates her vision for the future of Miss America. Quote, "In 5 years, think what a reputation the Miss America pageant could build in the schools of this country. Girls would no longer look upon the pageant as a beauty contest, but would respect the title for its genuine value to them and its rating in the nation." So a few weeks later, at the next meeting on December 20th, 1944, the board approved Slaughter's plan to implement a scholarship for Miss America 1945. Now, she had to do lots and lots of work to get that money together. She wrote handwritten letters to hundreds of companies, and she finally got the $5,000 together. And the word quickly spread that beauty and brains were going to be celebrated at the Miss America 1945 pageant. And interestingly enough, 20 of the 43 contestants that year were college students, and 6 had already graduated. So 60% were considered co-eds, which was way, way, way up from previous years. And the winner that year was a woman named Bess Meyerson. And this is from the program the Miss America pageant put out that year. And I just am always struck by this image because Miss Birmingham and Miss Texas and Miss North Carolina are either in their swimsuits or in costumes that really reveal their bodies. And then there's Miss New York City, Bess Meyerson, who is in her robe and cap, and she actually became the first Miss America who had graduated from college to win. She's also the first and only Jewish Miss America, and later in her life, in the late 1970s, she went on to run for U.S. Senate out of New York State. She didn't win the nomination, but she was very politically involved and had her own range of New York City scandals in the 1980s, which I'm happy to talk about if you're interested. But this was really a watershed moment for Miss America, not just because Bess Meyerson was Jewish. World War II had just ended. The news of the Holocaust was just starting to trickle out. She became national spokesperson for the ADL. She had a lot of discrimination when she was traveling in the American South. And so she was really transformative. And so it seems fitting that she became the first Miss America to get this $5,000 scholarship. Now, I also show this page because one of the things that I do in Here She Is, which was a ton of work and ends up being just a few pages of the final product, but I gathered Miss America program books, Miss USA program books, several other pageants, what used to be called America's Junior Miss, now called Distinguished Young Woman, and then state program books for Miss America. And those were from 1972 to 2015. And with the help of several Brown students, we coded those up to look at what were changes over the years. So one of the things I found most interesting, and which does make it into the book, is that over that time period, there were only 2 pieces of information that were shared every single year about contestants. So that was besides their age and the state they represented, it was their talent, what they were going to compete in as part of that component of the pageant, and then their college major. So this is a graph which actually doesn't make a ton of sense because it goes all over the place. But this is the number of women who competed at Miss America, so 50 to 51 women each year, and what their college major was, whether that was STEM or not. So the most contestants who competed in a given year who had a STEM major was 12. There's never been more than 12. And I found it really surprising that from 1972, that pageant was held in 1972, it's from Miss America 1973, weird pageant math. I'm happy to explain, not that important. But the number basically doesn't change at all. And there's just been such a huge push to move toward women in STEM. It's actually been part of the Miss America program. And so this I found really interesting. In case you're wondering, the most common majors for Miss America contestants are business and communication. So there was a tie there. So talent is this other component of Miss America that distinguishes it from Miss USA. And the most common talents, I don't have a pretty graphic for this per se, but the most common was singing. followed by dancing, and then playing an instrument. And that's true, like both those who win Miss America and those who compete, because oftentimes those groups look very different, but singers are more likely to win Miss America, but there's also just more of them. So I mentioned the tuition and the talent. So Miss America's talent, Miss USA doesn't. And I used to say Trump, as I said, and now the thing that I say is tits, because Miss USA was really born out of the Miss America pageant. When Lenora Slaughter was there in the 1950s, after she started this, added the talent component, added the scholarship component, added an interview component, she really wanted to move away from the bathing beauty origins of Miss America. And obviously it remained part of the competition until 2018, but the Miss Americas used to be crowned in their bathing suits. They would do appearances in bathing suits. And so when that stopped, when a few Miss Americas put their foot down and said, I won't be crowned and I won't do appearances, Catalina, who'd been one of the major swimsuit sponsors, said, yeah, we make bathing suits and this is really important to us. So we're going to go start our own pageant, like, see you later. And that's how Miss USA was born. And Miss USA has always really prioritized how someone looks in a bathing suit and how they look in their evening gown. And it's not confused about its message and what it should reflect about the American woman. It's like, we are about beauty and about appearance. And I think that that still was reflected both in the Trump era and still can be reflected in this word tits, because I like the T alliteration to keep that going. So as I mentioned, Donald Trump owned Miss Universe, Miss USA, and Miss Teen USA. So here he is pictured with three of those women. You can see Olivia Culpo was here as Miss Universe. He, in the 1980s, when he opened many of his casinos in Atlantic City, was interested in purchasing the Miss America pageant. And then he went to judge it actually in 1989, the year Gretchen Carlson gave up her crown. And he discovered that there was the scholarship thing and Miss America was nonprofit. And he was like, yeah, this one is not for me. So that's like on record in the newspaper. And less than 10 years later, when Miss Universe came up for sale, which is for profit, it has franchisees who pay to run the various state pageants, he said, this is the right move for me. He had recently married Marla Maples, and she had competed in the Miss USA pageant. She hadn't won in Georgia. She had won other pageant titles. She'd won Miss Hawaiian Tropic. So this was seen as a way to like get her as part of like quote unquote Trump Inc. And you know, the thing about Donald Trump here is that as the owner of this pageant, he fulfilled like every single negative stereotype that there is about men in pageants. So in terms of objectifying the women, in terms of oogling them, and he would go backstage, he would brag about it. I mean, he went on the Howard Stern show and talked about how he went backstage at Miss Teen USA. Of course, those girls weren't even of age when they were changing, because he said he had to like check the goods because he was the owner. So, you know, I think that when he ran for president, there were many reasons why people didn't take him seriously. Part of it was his connection to pageants. Part of it was his connection to reality TV. Part of it was there were parts we didn't think we should take seriously when obviously we should have. But there really has been this crossover between pageants and politics. So I'm happy to talk more about this. I just wanted to very briefly point out some of the state winners at Miss America who've gone on to political careers. So this is just from this past election cycle a few weeks ago. It seems like a few years, but just a few weeks ago. These are two former Miss Hawaiis who actually won. Lauren Cheap Matsumoto was Miss Hawaii 2011. She's a Republican. She won re-election to the State House. And Jeannie Capella was Miss Hawaii 2015, and this was her first run, and she won as well. And you can see probably by her endorsements like Planned Parenthood and things like that, that she's a Democrat. So it's just nice that I can show that there is actually a range in the political affiliation of former winners. And then Teresa Benitez Thompson won re-election to the Nevada Assembly, where she's majority leader. She's also a Democrat. And I think this is a really important example because Nevada is the first, and I think still the only state legislature to be majority female. And so it's very interesting to me the ways in which many state winners And pageant queens in other countries have used pageants as a pathway to power because other avenues weren't necessarily open to women in the past or in different scenarios. So let me just wrap this up by saying that there, in fact, was a Miss USA pageant just last week, last Monday, November 9th. And this is the eventual winner, Miss Mississippi, Asia Daniels. And I picked this picture because, again, I want to emphasize that Miss USA is about how you look. It's about sexiness. It's about putting it all out there. Asia was the first Black Miss Mississippi because she actually competed in the Miss America pageant 2 years ago. But I wanted to contrast this is the current Miss America, Camille Schreier, who is Miss Virginia, and her talent was this science experiment. And yes, she's wearing heels and there's like rhinestones on her clothes, but she's like much, much, much more covered up than you see Asia Daniels is here at Miss USA. And even when Asia competed at Miss America, this is her talent. She was a singer. And so it's definitely just a different vibe in general that I think, again, captures some of these complications of American womanhood that Miss America is not necessarily influencing, but definitely reflecting. And just to pull this all together in the era we are and why this is happening virtually, this is a shot of her crowning moment last week, and you can see the outgoing Miss USA. It's actually super interesting. She's a lawyer and an MBA and had been a college athlete, but she's got her bedazzled mask on to match her dress, and you can see the other contestants in the background. So I don't know. Obviously, this pageant happened live and in person and appeared on cable TV, but I think COVID is going to influence the future of pageants in ways that they were already changing, but I think like so many other things in our society, COVID's going to amplify it. So I'm very interested to see what will happen over the next few years. So I will end there. There I am with my three of my babies, my kids, and the book, and that's how you can email me on my website. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. So we have time now for questions. So you can either put a question into the chat or you can use the raised hand feature on the participants tab to raise your hand and ask a question verbally.
Or you can send it to me or Tracy privately if you don't want to ask yourself.
Yes. Great. First question on the chat. How does judging work at pageants? Who are the judges and what are the criteria?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So it depends what pageant. I'll tell you about Miss America because I just know a little bit more and I've actually judged within the Miss America system. So let me start with who the judges are first. So when I coded those pageant books, I also coded the judges and other things. So I can actually say that even from the 1970s to today, the majority of judges have been women and not men, which is sort of an interesting contrast to what a lot of people assume is true, that it's about men judging women. And at the Miss USA pageant last week, the entire judges panel were women. So there's definitely a shift going on there. In any case, within Miss America, for example, there's usually people who volunteer within the Miss America system. So I would say like 2 or 3 members of the judging panel have run a state pageant or have been a former winner themselves. And then there's people from kind of the community where the pageant is being held. So, you know, if you're looking at New Hampshire, there'll be like 2 or 3 people who are prominent in New Hampshire who are part of that panel. So the way it works too is you get a scale from 1 to 10. They tell you as a judge that everyone starts at a 5. And within a few seconds, you move them up to a 6 or down to a 4. And that's true for the interview, which is a 10-minute long interview that happens before the onstage pageant. That's true for talent, was true for swimsuit, and then for evening gown. So of the judges panel, they drop the highest and the lowest score. They form a top 5 or whatever at the end. And then some pageants, and it changes in different years, they'll then go to this ballot where you just rank who you think is number 1, who you think is number 2, et cetera, so that you can pick sort of who you think the best overall person is. So there's not necessarily a lot of training that goes into it. And I've judged Miss America's Outstanding Teen and Miss New Jersey, which are pretty big ones. And they really, I mean, the judges talk, and it can be a lot of fun if you have fun people on the panel, but we're not allowed to talk about the contestants. They're very, very strict about that. Not until the very last day when you find out who the finalists are, and there's like a procedure for how you talk about them. So I think this matters because there is a lot of scholarship money on the line. And now it's not just for the winner. It's like in certain states, you know, they're giving away $80,000 in scholarships at that pageant. And that's sometimes in direct cash payments and sometimes in kind tuition. So, you know, if you win, you're going to go to University of Alabama, gives out a lot of these. You get like 4 years paid for. If you go to Distinguished Young Woman, like that's kind of amazing. Like you win your state pageant and you can go to college for free for 4 years. So there is a sense of like seriousness that I feel like when I judge, because that's a lot of money. I mean, the money that winners get is much more than sort of what I consider one of the most prestigious scholarships for people going into college, which would be the Coca-Cola Scholars. So I've looked, and in some years, there's usually a majority of women, like 56% of the winners are women, but that's a $20,000 scholarship for all 4 years, which is not anything to sneeze at, but it's not the same thing. And so when people say, and you might recall John Oliver did something a few years ago about how is Miss America coming up with this crazy number of how much money they give away, but he was like, wow, like they still actually are the largest provider of scholarships to women. And he said, please, like AAUW and women engineers, can we get on this? But it is sort of a remarkable thing. And so I've judged this thing called the Sweetheart Pageant, which I could get into the history more, but basically it's just a pageant that first runner-ups used to go to in this rural community in Illinois. And when I judged that, it was, we all said there were many, that was a very pageant heavy crowd. And we were all like, oh, we don't feel this heaviness of like, who's going to win or who's going to go on to Miss America or get access to all this money. So I do emphasize that people take it really seriously. And when you get that inside view, not just for me, but for other people, it's like, okay, this is a little different than what I expected. And I can see people are developing interview skills and those sorts of things.
Great. There's a raised hand from Serena Levin.
Hi. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the size discrimination that occurs in all pageants. And like, I understand that Miss America did away with the bathing suit portion, but like, what are the efforts to make it more inclusive of people with different body types?
Yeah, well, let's be clear. When I showed that picture of the current Miss America doing her science experiment, and not super obvious, but I think you can tell, like, she's still thin and like extremely fit. So that was not, getting rid of swimsuit was not making bodies more diverse who are competing in the pageant. So not only do they all tend to be thin who compete, there's a presumption of heterosexuality, of Christianity. And again, there's been a lot of changes in the 21st century in terms of race and ethnicity, but, you know, for the vast majority of most of these pageants, the majority of winners have been white. So it is a major issue. And I think that there will be a more plus-sized winner at Miss America. I would say within the next decade, I would put money on that. There's a former Miss America's Outstanding Teen who, one of her like platform issues of her year was talking about this issue, and she has won like a Georgia preliminary and will be competing at Miss Georgia. She would have competed this summer, but, you know, COVID. And she's like tall and just much larger and like wouldn't consider herself thin. And so I would think that she is going to do extremely well. You know, in Miss USA, there is not a lot of diversity. I mean, I wrote an article for Glamour that came out last week, and I interviewed someone and she was like, oh, like, I know I'm going to have like the biggest thighs at the pageant. Like, I'm super curvy. And I like went and looked at her swimsuit picture and I was like, I'm not sure that that's how I would describe you 6'1" tall woman. So Miss USA, there's like very, very, very little body diversity. I do think that teen pageants have done something interesting, which is they include a physical fitness component. But Miss Teen USA is just modeling in physical, like in workout clothes, which are super tight, instead of swimsuit. But at Outstanding Teen and Distinguished Young Woman, they actually have to do a fitness routine on stage, like planks and jumping jacks, and like it's pretty aerobic. And so I think that's very interesting because it's about like what your body can do and not about how it looks. So we'll see how that changes things. We'll see if Miss America adds some fitness component, but until there are more contestants who are competing and people see contestants doing well, I'm not sure how they're going to change that 100-year history.
Great. There's another question in the chat. What's your opinion on child pageants, on the age they start at, on the pressure they put on them by their mothers? And I want to tack on one to this. Could you say a little about the relationship between those child pageants and Miss America?
Yeah. Okay, so the child beauty pageants are, you can agree or disagree about the skills that people can develop competing in the Miss pageants, right? But there's like a case to be made. You do develop these interview skills, or you are developing talent, etc. It's just much, much, much harder to do that with child beauty pageants. I've interviewed dozens and dozens of these moms, and I know what they say. And I think there's some truth to it, which is, they have a very different, not all of them, many of them have a very different life that they envision for their kids, which might include like a career in entertainment. So for them, like sending your kid to Brown is like completely foreign. And why would you put an effort to do these other after school activities when you could be trying to make it to Hollywood and like strike it rich? So for them, many of them see it as helping their kids by doing this young, getting them comfortable on stage. Now, when the kids are like under 1 year old, like they don't know what's going on, honestly. So like parents will carry their kids on stage. I don't think that matters. That is 100% for the parents, usually the moms. I think when you're talking about kids who are like 3 and recognize themselves in a mirror, and then you're going and you're putting fake eyelashes and fake teeth and fake tan and fake hair. And then the child looks in the mirror and maybe doesn't even recognize herself completely. And then you're saying, you're so beautiful. And like, they get all this attention. So what do they think when they don't have all that on? Are they not beautiful, or are they not worthy of attention? That's just much, much, much more complicated. And there've been a few studies, and I wouldn't say it's a study that I do in the book, but I'm able to track down some of the moms who I interviewed for my senior thesis, and then the girls who are now of age, to talk about what the long-term effects have been. And it definitely, the one thing I can say is that it impacted their relationships with their moms, sometimes in positive ways, but more often in negative ways. So this pressure to like compete and feel like they had to be perfect and that they were being forced to practice at a young age and give up other things was a pretty common theme. When kids are doing it, the moms are always talking about, oh, we go to the hotel and we do pool parties and we make friends, and like, that's all well and good, but those relationships don't necessarily last. So I think I looked at girls 6 and under when I was doing my thesis, and I think that was useful because there aren't a lot of other things that kids can do like this at that age. I mean, kids can start dance, but you're not really seeing kids do competitive dance till 6, 7, 8. And as they get older, and you see the girls moving out of child beauty pageants into things like cheerleading and dance and gymnastics at those ages, which I think there's lots of similarities between pageants and those activities in terms of the emphasized femininity and the body and being judged live in front of people. So the child beauty pageants are much more problematic. There's not a strong relationship between the kid pageants and the Miss pageants. There have been a few Miss Americas and Miss USAs who've done child beauty pageants, but they're definitely the exception. And in fact, in the Miss pageant world, it's kind of seen as a negative because people think maybe that they tend to be more robotic or rehearsed and less real, whatever that means, or authentic. And I talk about a little bit, and here she is, but I think that there's been this inverse relationship when like the child beauty pageants are really popular, the Miss pageants are less, or there's been some scandal, and vice versa. So it seems like we can't have too much pageants all at the same time. Like if you notice now, like there's much more coverage, again, pre-COVID, but of the Miss pageants, and like there's not a lot about child beauty pageants out there right now, especially since toddlers and tiaras went off the air.
Great. Another question in the chat. How influential do you believe beauty pageants are in the rise of other predominantly female competitions like competitive dance groups and competitive cheerleading? How do you personally believe today's media and social climate will affect the future of pageants?
Yeah, so I often say if JonBenet had done competitive cheer or maybe even competitive dance, that those communities would have been similarly vilified. Because the images that were shown, the videos and the pictures that came out, were showing someone who looked much older. But if you go to a lot of these competitions, even Irish dancing, like the makeup, the spray tan, it's very, those are just considered, that's how you do it because of the stage lights or because of whatever. I mean, I think it's also people see that those who win do it, and so they want to win, so they do it. They're not thinking about all the implications. So I think there's lots of overlap. Like I said, many of the child beauty pageant contestants move into those other areas as they get older. Because again, sort of what I was saying about Miss USA, you're not developing a talent per se when you're doing the pageants. Like, what is that talent? Whereas at Miss America, at least you're singing or dancing or playing a musical instrument, and that reflects more probably years that you've put into it. I do know people who learned to play just one piano piece in order to compete. But, I think that when Dance Moms was on, if people watch that, if you remember, they would like do contour on their arms so that their muscles looked more defined. They would do that on their abs. These were like 7, 8-year-old girls. And so there is this component that's like, it's how you look. You do have a body that's doing things, and there's a lot of talent involved, but it's more complicated than just that. And I think even if you're not talking about like dance competition culture, you think about ballet companies, the emphasis on how you look, what those women and men put their bodies through, but especially the women in terms of weight, and, restricting calories and that sort of thing. So I think anything that's performative and where you're judged, you can also think about this with figure skating and gymnastics. There's just going to be this element that how your body looks matters. And that just doesn't seem to be as true for men's activities, right? So like you think about the NFL, like, or I think about Michael Phelps or someone who, really transcends the boundaries of sport, and they're celebrated for what their bodies do. And like, yes, it totally helps that Tom Brady is thought to be extremely good looking by most people, myself included, but that has nothing to do with how he actually performs on the field. So, that's just a wide disparity that still exists between men and women, and we see it in the kids' activities. So I worry in Playing to Win, I talk about this, like upper middle class parents of girls are much more likely to put them in soccer than in dance. And, soccer just is much more associated with skills that you might need to get into a competitive college like Brown, or to get a consulting job. It's this like head-to-head competition. The dance competitions aren't head-to-head, for example. Everyone gets something. Everyone walks away with something, whereas in soccer, there's a score, and not always, but usually there's a winner and loser. So I think there are a lot of class implications that then matters for inequality as well.
Great. And the second part of the question, how do you think today's media and social climate will affect the future of pageants? And you end the book talking about the Me Too era. So what do you think it's going to look like moving forward?
Well, in terms of the media, I think that, do I think Miss America will exist in its current form 100 years from now? I don't, but I don't think beauty pageant culture is going anywhere. So a decade from now, I think Miss America will still be happening, but it probably won't be shown on network TV or maybe even cable TV. I think it'll be held in a ballroom and hotel ballroom, and some people will still want the title and want to compete, and that's fine. I think that particularly with streaming services and all these other reality TV shows. I mean, starting with American Idol earlier in this century, when there's a serial format, when you're getting to know contestants and their stories, whether they're shaped by producers or not, you're still getting to know people more than in a 2-hour, once-a-year broadcast that really probably doesn't even reflect what it's like to be a national pageant winner. So I don't think that what used to work when Miss America was a top 10 show every year in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, top 10 every single year. There's just no way that it ever returns to that, and perhaps doesn't stay on cable TV. Maybe if they can find some way to transform themselves to some serial reality format, there would be an audience on a platform like Netflix, but I'm not sure if they're willing or able to do that. So that's a major thing. And, the Me Too stuff is really interesting to me because when they cut swimsuit, and there was a scholarship that was given after that was about promoting diversity. And when the Miss America program announced it, they wrote what the anonymous donor had said, which was that a smart woman shouldn't need to parade around in a bathing suit. And there was this intense backlash from people who competed at Miss America. And they would put up a picture, these former contestants would put up a picture of themselves in their bathing suits and then write something and sign their name with all their degrees after it. And they were like, hey, I'm a smart woman and I can choose to walk around in my bathing suit if I want to. And I think that is really indicative of women today in terms of don't slut shame me. This is an older trope. It's still what you're wearing, you're asking for it if you're sexually harassed or assaulted. And so I think the Me Too is having a different effect. And it's hey, if I want to do this, who are you to tell me not to do it? So I think that's really interesting. And, I don't think people are cultural dupes. I don't think these women are cultural dupes. I think more broadly, people are much savvier about culture consumption. We know the images we see in magazines, on Instagram, they're photoshopped or they're face tuned or whatever. And so I don't think the same way that kids thought in the 50s and 60s and 70s, you roll out of bed and you look like that. People don't think that today. And so just the choice to do a pageant might make sense for an individual, but doesn't matter to other people if they do that, if that makes sense.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank you again for talking with us today. And thanks to everybody for coming. Have a good night.
Thanks.